to chapter 20 after we finish chapter 19, so there's going to be a little bit of an awkward pause in the video. I'm sorry. So far in chapter 9, we've talked about genetic structuring. And somebody tell me what you think of when you hear genetic structuring. Genotype frequencies, right? That is what you all think of when you hear genetic structuring. You think genotype frequencies because that's exactly what you ought to do. All right? Now, what are some of the mechanisms that will change genotype frequencies from one generation to the next? What are some of these mechanisms? Amanda? Mutations, right? Either creating new alleles or creating new copies of the same allele, Carlos and then Levi. Genetic drift, these random changes that have to do with some individuals die or don't reproduce, not because they couldn't attract a mate or because they, for some reason, were impeded from surviving because of their phenotype. It's just random, like random changes. A lot of those would be like, a natural disaster that just shrinks the population down a great deal, some kind of a bottleneck event. Or some individuals end up founding a new place, oftentimes by accident, right? A group of birds blown to an island in the midst of a storm. Levi, you were going to go drift. Mia, gene flow, right? Exactly that idea of you already have established populations. So some individuals from a population going and founding a new population, that's not gene flow. That's genetic drift. Okay? Gene flow is you already have established populations and individuals move between the two. Allison and then Ethan. Sexual selection. That was yours? Well, I think that's all of them. Oh no, we still have one more, right? So sexual selection, where some individuals are better able to attract mates than others. We've got one more. Yeah, Mia. Natural selection, right? Some individuals survive better than others because of their phenotype. And that's the answer to this question here. How is it adaptive? The only mechanism of all of these that is adaptive evolution, that makes these individuals better equipped to survive in the environment in which they live, is natural selection. Okay? So natural selection is the survival of the fittest. Okay, those two phrases, natural selection, survival of the fittest, these are synonymous, okay? And basically it boils down to this. Those that are most able to survive and form viable offspring are going to make the biggest contribution to the gene pool in the next generation, right? There's nothing particularly sinister about this idea of natural selection, okay? All it's saying is that those individuals that survive best and have the best opportunity to make viable offspring are going to make the biggest impact on the gene pool. So if you survive twice as long as the average individual, statistically speaking, you should produce more offspring than the individuals that survive half as long as you do, right? It's a little bit different with humans because we don't really care so much about natural selection. We kind of do our own thing. Anyways, it's another story for another time. So anyways, over time, the population starts to look more and more and more like these fit individuals. Like these individuals that are surviving better, that are forming more viable offspring than other individuals. Okay? This is the idea of adaptive evolution. Okay? That again, the population over time starts to look more and more like those individuals that for some reason survive better and form more viable offspring than other individuals. All right? Does that make sense? So again, there's nothing sinister about this idea. It's just, and this is the reality as long as certain things are true. So what has to be true in order for natural selection to happen? Let's think about this for a little bit. Thinking critically. So if some individuals are going to survive better and leave more viable offspring than other individuals, what things have to be true? Yeah, Mia.
The population has to have some variation.
Yeah, there has to be variation within the population, right? If every individual looks exactly the same, no individual is for phenotypic reasons going to survive better and leave more viable offspring, right? Every individual could still look the same and drift could still be a factor. Although if every individual looks exactly the same, they're probably exactly the same genetically, and therefore drift is irrelevant because you're not generating genetic changes. Yeah, absolutely. You have to have variation in place. Any other things that have to be true? Yeah, Chris.
There has to be like a stressor, like putting. Like
Yeah, and so that stressor is there have to be more offspring produced that can possibly survive. Okay? That is, some individuals don't get to survive. There aren't enough resources to support an infinitely large population. Okay? There aren't enough resources. So yeah, I mean, we could just sum that up as there's some kind of a stressor, right? To where there's different, another way you can say this is there's differential survival, right? Some individuals survive better than others because of the way they're structured. Okay, and then there's one other thing. So again, there has to be variation. Some variants have to survive better than others, and so that basically comes from there are more offspring produced than can possibly survive. So some individuals are making better offspring. And then the third one is whatever those traits are that make individuals fit have to be able to be passed down to the next generation, right? You have to be able to pass on whatever that trait is that makes you more fit. Because if you can't, natural selection can't work, right? If you can't pass on that trait, the population is not going to look more like you in the next generation, right? Make sense? So those three things have to be true. Now, when the phenotype varies over a spectrum, and so what we're talking about here is not, so Mia, you talked about that there has to be variation, right? And so in our example that we used before, we did blue eyes and green eyes, right? And that's variation. That's all you need for natural selection to work. But this is talking about if the phenotype varies over a spectrum, something like height, right? Where it's like you've got really short, really tall, and basically everything in between, right? We're varying over a spectrum. We don't have discrete traits, blue and green. We have something that's more of a spectrum, okay? Like height. So when you have the phenotype varying over a spectrum like that, natural selection can come in three forms. And again, natural selection, it's just it's an adaptive change in allele frequencies, right? So it can come in three forms. The first one, oh gosh, these are going to come out of order. This is terrible. I'm going to put all three. Oh my gosh, that is just terrible. Okay, this is really frustrating. You probably don't care, but I'm really upset. But anyways, I'm going to power through it for your benefit. So stabilizing selection is that basically more and more individuals start to have the average characteristic. So again, using the character human height, the average height for an American male is, I think, 5'8". Okay, it varies all the time, but I think the last time I checked, the average height for an American male was 5'8". Okay, all right. So let's think about this, and this is North America, not just the United States. Okay, all right. So in stabilizing selection, that average does not change, but a greater percentage of the population starts to have that average height. Another way to look at it is that the extremes start to become rarer. Okay? You start to have fewer and fewer individuals that are short and tall. More individuals that are at that average characteristic. All right? Make sense? Stabilizing. The next one is directional. And so in directional selection, you move towards one of the extremes. The population shifts taller or the population shifts shorter. And when that happens, you start to get taller and taller and taller, or shorter and shorter and shorter, more extreme than what you've ever seen before, because you're starting to weed out all of the genetic design for, let's say if you're moving taller, right? So your population is getting taller, you've got directional selection in that direction. The individuals that are shorter are not contributing as much to the next generation as the individuals that are taller, so you start to weed out that programming for short stature. And when you do, you start to really allow that tall stature to shine, right? And you start to get some extremes, again, that you've never seen before. Individuals taller than you've ever seen before. All right? Make sense? Now, you're going to hit a limit at some point because you're dependent upon what variation is there genetically and also what's biomechanically possible. I don't know if I've shared this with you before, but something happened in graduate school for me that made me really sad. And we were talking about biomechanics and what kinds of structures are biomechanically possible. And I learned in that class that if you're an arthropod, like an insect or a crustacean or a spider, that your size is limited by the weight of your exoskeleton. That at some point you get too big that you couldn't get any bigger because you couldn't actually physically move your exoskeleton. And the reason why that made me sad is because up until that point, I had always dreamed about getting pill bugs, roly-polies, selectively breeding them for the largest individuals, and producing a dog-sized roly-poly. How incredible would that be? Right? You go to a dog park, and people are bringing dogs of all shapes and sizes, and you walk your roly-poly on a leash right into that dog park. I mean, how cool would that be? Or better yet, you just keep going, and then you're like, I'm gonna ride this thing like a horse. You can ride your horse around and jump the little fancy gates and all that stuff, do the barrel racing. I'm gonna ride my roly-poly with its dozens of legs. I mean, that was just so cool. And I learned that day that it's actually not biomechanically possible. And so it was helpful to learn that natural selection can only work up until the point where you have the variation to make it happen, and up until the point to where it's no longer biomechanically possible. Okay? Which is sad. So if you're saddened by that, you should be, and it's okay. We can mourn together that you could not selectively breed roly-polies to get something the size of a dog, although that would be cool. All right, then disruptive. So disruptive is you're moving towards both extremes. Your average characteristic is getting less and less common. Okay? You're moving towards both extremes away from the average. All right. Yeah, Micah.
What's the order that you think they should be?
The order that I think they should be? Well, in this order here. Not because, although this is also in the order of how common they are, stabilizing selection is by far the most common form of natural selection, acting on this kind of a phenotype, followed by directional, and then lastly, disruptive. Disruptive is extremely rare when the average condition is selected against. That's very rare and only happens in these kinds of situations where sometimes you have phenotypes that are successful because they're rare. You call that frequency-dependent selection. And so you find it, are you going to ask for an example? Okay. An example, you find it in clams. So I don't know if you know this or not, but clams are delicious. Absolutely delicious. Many animals understand this. So many things eat clams. A lot of shorebirds eat clams, and what they'll do is they'll go and they'll pick a clam up, they'll fly to a particular height, and they'll drop it down onto a rock to break it. Okay? Because I don't know if you know this, but clams are alive, and they don't really like you to open their shells, right? Which is why you throw them into a pot of boiling water. Not just water, because you're like, that's not very flavorful. You throw them into a pot of some kind of flavorful boiling liquid, and you know they're done when they open, because the clam is now dead, and it's opened up, and you're like, oh, it's wonderful. Now we can eat it. But anyways, the really heavy clams are very hard to break. Like the bird would just have to keep taking it up and dropping it and taking it up and dropping it and taking it up and dropping it and taking it up and dropping it. Okay? Right? Does it make sense? Because it's big, it's got a thick shell, it's hard to break. The small clams, they're easy to break, but the act of actually taking it up is probably more costly than what you get from a small clam. Okay? So the birds prefer the intermediate sized clams. And so the small and the large clams are selected not because of their rarity, but because of how difficult or the energy you have to invest in order to get a particular energy output. And in that case, you can actually see the disruptive selection, not because of rarity per se, but because of predatory pressure. That make sense? Okay. Okay, we already talked about what are some of the factors necessary for natural selection. And so here you can see different examples of this. So here is stabilizing selection, and this is in the number of eggs. Yeah, so in the number of eggs produced, that there's an average number of eggs produced. And you might be thinking like, man, if I were a bird, I'm going to lay as many eggs as possible, right? Because I may not survive for a second reproductive cycle. But the thing is, the more eggs you produce, the smaller the average size of the egg, because you only have a certain amount of energy in order to invest in all of life's activities. What do we call that again? The principle of allocation, right? You only have a certain amount of energy at your disposal to invest in everything. Anyways, so in stabilizing selection, you start to see more and more individuals over time producing the average clutch size, the average number of eggs. Here's directional selection, moving in the direction of a darker coloration or lighter coloration. And this is something we've actually seen over time studying peppered moths. Okay? That at the time of the Industrial Revolution, or at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the dark morphs were very rare. But then the dark morphs become selected for because things aren't as light. Okay? The sky is now smoggy. Everything is just a little bit darker, covered in soot, and so you start to get the dark morph selected. Diversifying or disruptive selection, you start to have things, the average condition selected against. And in this case, it's giving you, because they're basically two different extremes in the range of this species. And in both of those ranges, there are certain things that are really helpful, but being just kind of that average characteristic between the really interesting morph where you get a blend of colors and the dark morph is not very successful. All right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a lecture break. And I don't want you to look to the next slide, because the next slide will give you the answer to this. And I don't want you to look to the next slide. Actually, the next slide will give you an answer to this, and it may be different than your answer to this. But I want you to think about this. If we have a mechanism, are you looking at the next slide? No. Don't look at the next slide. If we have a mechanism of adaptive selection, okay, or an adaptive evolution, if we've got natural selection, right, where certain phenotypes should survive better than others, and so over time, in theory, your population should be as fit for its environment as possible, right? Because the individuals that do best in it are going to leave the most offspring. And so if the population starts to look more and more like those individuals that are best equipped to handle the environment, why do we find some populations with maladaptive features? Okay? Why do we find features in organisms that make them very poorly equipped to live in their particular environment? Okay? Let me give you an example of that. One that we've talked about before. Is this what you were going to ask, Ethan? You can ask your question first. I'll give you an example of what I mean.
I was just going to say, is it like, would it be because...
Oh, wait, no, we're going to do our lecture break. So don't give me an answer. You're going to talk about it with those around you. Okay? So let me give you an example, and this will help to clue your discussion if you think critically. Okay? Is why do cheetahs have an enormous number of cardiovascular issues and have a very short life expectancy? Like, it's not good. This is not helpful. They are almost completely outcompeted by the other big cats in Africa. I mean, they're awesome, right? I mean, cheetahs are awesome, right? The fact that you can go from 0 to almost 70 miles an hour almost instantly, that's awesome. But, they can only do that for maybe 15, 20 seconds, and then their brain would explode if they kept trying to do it. But anyways, that's another story for another time. Why do they have such a short life expectancy and therefore get almost entirely outcompeted by the other big cats in Africa? All right? So that's kind of the idea of what this question is. Why do some populations have features that are maladaptive, that do not make them well suited for their environment? All right? Take 2 minutes. Talk with those around you and come up with an answer to this question. I mean, it's basically this question here. Why do populations maintain alleles that contribute to poor phenotypes?
I wonder.
That's horrible. There's a
wonder, like,
grammatical issue in the first sentence.
Could it be because like maybe there was like a bottleneck effect, like with the cheetahs, and so now the only thing that's left is just poor genotypes that produce poor phenotypes. Does that make sense? You know, like if all the good genes are gone, now you're just stuck with like terrible alleles at that point. So you're only going to produce terrible alleles until either maybe by mutation you get better or you just go.
I'm thinking that's what might eventually be
Say that again, sorry.
at one point, one specific phenotype might be the desire, but the problem with that is, like, for example, how some birds have, like, the males have the bright color and the females have the dull color. At some point, there's not going to be as many bright colored males now. The duller colored males would allow for the species to survive because they're not as likely to be predators because they're not as
Okay.
bright.
Yeah.
So it's the hope to continue the species.
Yeah. So like
The
the
desirable trait is its way.
yeah. Interesting. I never thought of it. That's a good idea.
Yeah, because there's some.
What if there's something alive in there? What if there's something alive in there? What would you do if your parents mailed you like a plastic container full of cockroaches? Because I get those in the mail and it brings me such joy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not from my parents, but from biological supply companies. Gosh, if my parents sent me that,
Like
if my parents just sent me anything. Gosh, my parents. All right. What do we have? What are some ideas? Yeah, Amanda.
So one example is like with the
Amanda's talking.
one example is with the cuttlefish is that like when it comes to mating season, some of like I forget which species of cuttlefish it is, but the males are generally big, and so they would often fight over the female. Well, there's one smaller male that looks like a female, would sneak and pass them to and would successfully fertilize the female while the bigger ones are fighting.
Which it took us a while to figure that out. It's not only in cuttlefish. A lot of animals have that alternative strategy. And so yeah, I mean, so your point is that sometimes we don't know everything, and we don't know that some features actually might be really helpful. You're like, why would there be these tiny males? And you're like, I understand, because there's this big dominant male that controls the territory, and those small males can hide out in there, and the big male doesn't even know they're there. Doesn't even know they're there. That is great. Absolutely. So sometimes the story is more complicated than what it seems, right? And so we may think it's a maladaptive trait or a poor phenotype, but in reality, it may actually be a very successful strategy to combat, the alternative strategy. Yeah, Cameron.
It's possible, like, since populations are small, like in the case of cheetahs, that they're all so genetically similar that even with continued breeding, that there isn't enough variation that we will to have phenotypes.
Yeah, remember, natural selection requires variation. If you have very little variation, natural selection cannot work as efficiently as it can with a large amount of variation. Absolutely. So sometimes you're prevented from having successful phenotypes because that variant doesn't exist. Yeah. And drift, you talked about like a bottleneck event. Drift works oftentimes against natural selection. Now, drift can work with it, right? Drift's just a random change. It can work with natural selection, but often it's going to work against natural selection. Yeah. Any other ideas?
I was just thinking in terms of like sickle cell disease, where even though they aren't as healthy as
Yes.
without it, just because of like malaria in the area, it makes them better fit for healthier disease.
Yes, you've got another thing is sometimes the allele is successful for a particular situation and then is unsuccessful in another situation. And sickle cell trait is an excellent example of that. So I don't think anybody would argue that sickle cell anemia is a great phenotype. But having the thing about sickle cell trait is the heterozygous individuals do not have the dominant phenotype. They actually have an intermediate phenotype. And so there's the dominant phenotype where you have two normal versions of that gene. Your red blood cells are not sickle shaped, right? They don't clump together. They don't clot in unusual ways. Then you have the homozygous recessive characteristic where you have two bad forms of that gene. All of your red blood cells are sickle shaped. They clot very irregularly. They have a hard time carrying oxygen. The heterozygous condition has an intermediate phenotype where some of your red blood cells are sickle shaped. Some of your red blood cells do not carry oxygen efficiently, but you have enough healthy red blood cells that you can compensate for that unless you're in high elevation areas. And so people with sickle cell trait that don't have sickle cell anemia, they still struggle in high elevation areas because there the oxygen in the atmosphere is incredibly low. And so not having all of your red blood cells maximizing their oxygen carrying potential has an issue. But anyways, yeah, so that's selected for because of the presence of malaria. People with sickle cell trait and sickle cell anemia have a very difficult time being parasitized by malaria. And so in the presence of malaria, it actually is really successful, but then it leads to a maladaptive phenotype, right? A phenotype that shortens life expectancy, that shortens productivity, and a number of other things. Yeah. Yeah, Micah.
You were saying here that if you're going to be passing down adaptive traits, you're going to be passing down maladaptive traits as well.
Oh, absolutely. So this one we call piggybacking or coattailing. So have you ever heard the saying like you rode in on someone else's coattails? Right? It's like when you campaigned to be vice president of the student body in high school and you just happened to be friends with the person that you knew was going to become president. Nobody liked you, right? But you're like, I'm campaigning with somebody that's going to be elected president, right? So you ride in on their coattails. Yeah, we call that coattailing or piggybacking, where some individuals are really successful, and so they're passing on those traits that make them successful, but they're also passing on some traits that could lead to them being very unsuccessful. Yeah, Allison.
I don't know if this is considered natural selection, but the intervention of humans.
Disturbance. Yeah, we usually.
Disturbance or helping weaker.
Oh, yeah.
To survive.
Yeah, I mean, and we do it for organisms, like if you're going to do it for something that's critically endangered, right, and there are very few individuals left and you're just trying to keep that species alive, that's one thing. But we do it for things that really aren't critically endangered, but it's just because we love them, right? It's like you see a deer, you see a fawn whose mom has been hit by a car, and I don't know if you know this or not, but there are plenty of deer. I mean, they are not struggling. They are nowhere near being critically endangered. But it's like there's just something that tugs at our heartstrings, right? It's like this poor fawn, I cannot bear the idea of it starving to death, and I don't feel like eating it, so we'll nurse it, right? We'll bottle feed it, and we'll get it to adulthood, and then hope it can live a normal deer life after being bottle fed by a human for several weeks, right? But yeah, absolutely, we do these kinds of things all the time. That's actually illegal in the state of Ohio, by the way. You cannot rehabilitate fawns, whether they are injured or not. You have to let them die or euthanize them. In case you were wondering. Sure. Oh, sure, yeah. Like we wanted a dog with a flat face, and then we're like, oh no, it's got respiratory issues, right? Yeah. Good. Or we want a dog that's massive, and then, oh no, it doesn't actually pump blood efficiently through its body. Whoops. All right, good. Yeah, so natural selection is limited by present variation. We talked about this. Gosh, Cheyenne, I'm so sorry. It's not okay.
So going back to the dog thing.
Yeah.
Why? Because I had two golden retrievers, both like pure golden retrievers.
Yep.
But they both had really bad hip problems. Like, why?
Yeah.
Is that
So
also human?
yeah. So when you breed, it's called pure breeding, right? Or the purebreds. And so the way you do it is you only allow individuals with the characteristics that you want that are also purebred to reproduce. And so it lowers the genetic diversity and makes it more common that rare alleles are actually going to become fairly common. And so that's what's happening there is like a rare allele of having, malformed hips becomes a lot more common because of the pure breeding process. It wasn't necessarily piggybacking and a complication of getting what you wanted, but it's just to get what you want, you have to restrict who's allowed to breed. And so when you do that, you lose some of the variation. Yeah. And it makes rare characteristics more common. This is why having children with close relatives is not a great idea. It's because rare genetic issues start to become more common when you lower the genetic variation. Yeah. So you have to know that genes are located on chromosomes, and then two genes may be too close to separate during gamete formation. This is yours with this piggybacking, right, or coattailing. So a bad allele for one gene may be selected along with a good allele for a more important gene. Oh, gosh, this one's big. Nobody said this. I forgot this one. Two phenotypes may be separated by an insurmountable gap. And so what's meaning here is you may not be able to eliminate something, or you may not be able to get something because the two different variants are so different. That's so different that you couldn't get something intermediate that would be better because you have discrete traits rather than like a continuum. Most evolutionary forces are not adaptive and yet are still at work in these populations, like drift and gene flow and mutations. Yeah, Mika. Yeah, so in some species, you have, say, two morphs that are just really, really different. So you have it pretty common in mollusks and different snails, where you get two different color morphs that are completely different, and both of them don't blend well in the environment. And so if you could actually merge the two phenotypes, you could have something that would build a much better camouflaged animal. But the two phenotypes are so different from each other in how they develop, in how they work, or even in where the particular organisms are and what they prefer as far as breeding, that they don't actually merge together. They don't form something that would be a more successful phenotype. You see this a lot in behaviors. You see this a lot in behaviors to where orcas are a good example of this, killer whales, where you have basically two different behavioral morphs. You have those that are fish eaters and you have those that are whale eaters. And they're so behaviorally different that they don't interact. Because the whale eaters, they can't use echolocation because whales use echolocation, and that would signal the whale to your presence. And so they hunt differently, they feed differently, they interact differently. And then the fish eaters, they use echolocation and hunt in a completely different way. And so those individuals, an intermediate diet would be much better, because if a fish population crashes and the fish eaters, they've got no food, right? If a whale population crashes, the whale eaters, they have no food. An intermediate form would be best, a diet that's more varied, but you don't get that because the two behaviors are just so different that they don't even interact. We're actually watching an example of speciation happening, is they're separating into separate species. You also have to understand, and this comes right out of the textbook, that evolution has no purpose. There's no foresight, right? There's no thing about these evolutionary processes that look to see what's going to be best for this environment. Let's make the organism like that. Okay? It's a combination of various factors that change allele frequencies that are at work. Okay. Any questions about chapter 19? Yeah, Mia.
What would be an example of, I remember we were talking about what we need for natural selection to happen, but what would be like an example of a trait that like cannot be passed down?
Of a trait that can't be passed down?
Yeah, like we were saying, like the trait has to be able to be passed down.
Oh, sure. A lot of learned behaviors can't be passed down genetically. They have to be taught. And so a lot of songbirds, they will sing innately. Like they sing, but they will not sing the correct song unless they are taught. And they have to be taught. So if you take a songbird and you raise it apart from its parents, it will learn the song of its foster parents, or it will learn, so it's like if you foster it with a different species, it'll learn that species' song. And then it'll never be able to attract females, and it'll never mate. Very sad, right? But that's a trait that can't be passed down. It has to be taught or learned. Yeah. So sad. All right, so as we transition to chapter 20, there's something I wanted to tell you. So evaluations are now open, right? You can access, access evaluations for course assessments? Have you started getting notifications from Canvas like, hey, you are taking these courses? If they haven't started yet, they should start very soon, and I think they have started. So if you're not getting those emails, surprise, you're supposed to fill out evaluations for all your courses. So I try to do something every semester to entice you to complete that evaluation. Not to entice you to give me good scores, that I don't want, right? I want you to give an honest assessment of my teaching and of this course, but to entice you to actually complete that evaluation. Here's what I'm thinking for this year. So we have our fourth and final exam on the Friday before finals week, right? Which means that the final exam is not going to cover any new material, but rather it's just going to cover material that existed on the previous 4 exams, right? And so here's the offer I want to make you. If you complete the evaluation for this course, I will allow you to replace any exam score that you've had with your score on the final exam, okay? Regardless of how big the differences in those scores are. And I know some of you might be thinking, I don't want to replace any of my scores. So I want to make you another offer. And so if you take the final exam, if you complete the evaluation for this course and you take the final exam, you can replace any of your exam scores. Even the one that was already dropped, you can replace that with your final score, so then something else could be dropped. Or if you are already happy with your exam average, I will put your exam average as your score on the final exam.
For which exam?
Your exam average.
Oh.
So the average of your 3, and it's only of the 3 highest exams, right? The lowest exam gets dropped. So the average would only include your score on your 3 highest exams. And if you are satisfied with that exam average, I will be willing to put your exam average as your score on the final exam. Now, you will still need to come. I know you will still need to come when we take our final exam. You will have to take the final exam. How you take it is up to you, right? But you will have to come. You will take the final exam. But I will be willing to put your exam average as your score on the final exam. So you could take the final exam, and if that score is lower than your exam average, I will replace that score with your exam average on your 3 higher exam scores. All right? Yeah, Emily.
Are you giving us a study guide for the final?
Oh, you bet. You bet. And I'll also give you a study guide for exam 4, which will happen again the Friday before finals week. But I'll get you that study guide. I'm not going to give it to you now. I'll give it to you after Thanksgiving break. All right? Any other questions, thoughts? I usually do it to where if everybody in the class completes the evaluation, then I'll do that. But anyways, if you individually do it, I will make that offer to you. So if your final exam score is lower than your exam average, I will replace it with your exam average. If your final exam is higher than any other your exams, I will replace your lowest exam score with your score on your final exam. All right? Okay. Chapter 20. Chapter 20, we have a few framing questions that we are going to attempt to answer. Not all today. We have Friday as well. Today we'll probably just get to the first one. And so that first one is this. What information can we gather from the branches in a phylogeny? So many times this semester we have looked at phylogenies. And we have talked about how do we interpret these phylogenies. Chapter 20, this is what chapter 20 is all about. I don't know if you got this, but chapter 19 is all about what we would call microevolution. Change in allele frequencies, evolution at the level of the population. Chapter 20 is really all about, okay, if we extrapolate this out, we should be able to get macroevolution and to be able to generate all of the diversity of life from a single organism, and then how would that actually work? Okay? And so 20 is going to talk specifically about phylogenetic trees. All right. So the phylogenetic trees give us information about the relationships among those groups. Like this. The closer the branches are, the more closely the groups are related. So we've looked at many phylogenies in this course so far. I don't want to do orange. So the phylogeny I drew for you for hominids, we had our species, Homo sapiens, and Homo neanderthalensis as the closest branches together in that phylogeny, right? And so you can very correctly state that according to this phylogeny, these two species are more closely related than either species is to any of the others. Okay? According to this phylogeny, right? And that's the kicker. It's because then we have to wonder, is the phylogeny even true? And we'll talk about this in a couple of slides. Like, what do you even have to do to make phylogenies? How does that even work? So the branching points are the point at which one branch splits into two, or in the case of a polytomy where one branch splits into more than two. These are called nodes, and they represent the ancestor of the branches that came from that node. Okay, so every point on there needs to represent an actual ancestor, in theory. Right? In theory, it should represent an organism that actually existed. And so sister taxa is a term that describes any groups that share a node. Any groups that share a node. So any branches that branch from the same node are called sister taxa. Now here's some information you cannot gather from the branches of a phylogeny. The length of the branch rarely represents time. Okay? The length of the branch rarely represents time. So you can't look at a phylogeny and say that these two organisms, their ancestor existed half of the time ago or half of the distance ago as these ancestors existed. The lengths of the branches are rarely used to represent actual time. Now, you also can't determine from a phylogeny, just a basic phylogeny, which group is believed to be the most primitive unless you do this. In order to determine which groups are more primitive, that is more like the ancestor of everyone in that group, you have to root the tree. Okay, you have to make it to where it actually looks like a tree. Otherwise, and all of the phylogenies I gave to you, they were all rooted and they looked like trees. If you look at a phylogeny that is not rooted, it looks like a wheel. Okay, where you can still see which groups are more closely related, but you have no idea of which came first. And here's how you root the tree. The only way to root a phylogenetic tree is to take what you believe is the ancestor for every group in that tree and set it outside of your phylogeny. And so you compare all of the groups in your phylogeny to that assumed ancestor. Okay, this is the only way to root a tree. And so in another way, you can say that this is the only way in which you can actually make a phylogenetic tree, is to assume that all the organisms in that tree did in fact descend from the same ancestor, and they descended from the ancestor you chose. What does that actually mean about phylogenetic trees? If the only way we can build them is to assume that every organism on that tree descended from the same ancestor and descended from the ancestor you used to build that tree. What does that mean? Right, so it is just an assumption, and so it's heavily influenced by the bias of the person building that phylogeny, right? And it's going to be heavily influenced by which characters you weighed as more important, right? So if you think genetic similarity is the most important, that's going to produce you a certain kind of tree. Whereas if you think, morphological features or the way the organisms are structured are more important, that's going to produce you oftentimes a different kind of tree. Or if you think how organisms develop is most important, that's going to produce you a different kind of tree, right? So let's think about this whole protostomes versus deuterostomes. Is that tree built on morphological features? Okay? So are we more similar morphologically to echinoderms than we are to like an arthropod? Do you look more like a starfish, which is a nonsense word, it's not a fish? Do you look more like a sea star? Let's do this one. Do you look more like an asteroid than you do like a beetle? Maybe. But you certainly develop more like an asteroid than you do like a beetle, right? And so that is emphasizing developmental differences, right? Kangaroos are bipedal and we are bipedal, right? But kangaroos are marsupials and have a very different developmental process than we do, right? So we are putting the different developmental process as more important than the presence of bipedalism. Okay, so what this means is that phylogenies are subject to the bias of the characters you choose to build the phylogeny and the perceived ancestry. All right? This is something we've talked about a great deal. Polytomies, when we see those in phylogenetic trees, we know that that means that these relationships are not understood. We do not know how all these organisms came from a particular ancestor. Yeah, Chris.
So in a polytomy, are they even related, or are they just like through like groups that are like we don't know what to do with them, so we're just gonna put them on a four?
Both are true.
Okay.
Yeah, the phylogeny could give you an indication that you're trying to link groups together that ought not be linked together, or it could tell you that we need more data. We need more data. What's interesting is if you take all of the genetic material from everybody who submitted their DNA to 23andMe or Ancestry, and you try to build a phylogeny to represent every single like key genetic characteristic, you'll get a polytomy. And we know that we're all related, right? And so it's there, we don't have enough data. If you had DNA from every single person on Earth, you would probably eliminate those polytomies. All right, so here is a rooted tree for all living organisms. Okay, here's a rooted tree, and according to this tree, okay, bacteria are the most primitive group. They would be the most like this ancestor because it requires only one branch from this ancestor, right? This node represents an actual ancestor, right? And a single branching event produces bacteria. Whereas here you have to get this one branching event and a second branching event to produce the archaeans here and the eukaryotes here. Okay? Right? So according to this phylogeny, the most primitive group is the bacteria. But in order to build this, you have to root it. And what's the only way to root a phylogenetic tree? To take an ancestor of this entire group that you would believe would be the ancestor for this. And so the ancestor of all living forms would be something like a protocell. Your proposed idea of what the original life form would look like that originated from non-living material. All right, and here's an unrooted tree, and we're done. Have a wonderful Wednesday. Get your initial homework post in. Tell other people to get their initial homework post in. Man, that